So now let's take a look at the other characters in the magicians' lives. Now the book contains a lot of characters as we look at the full lifetimes of two magicians, but we're just going to focus on the ones that actually overlap into the movie. First, we have Julia, Angier's wife, who we don't really get to see very much in the movie because she dies. And while she does shape his character and his career, she does so in the book too, and in a much more compelling way. Really, it's Julia who wants the stage career. Angier could almost take it or leave it, but it's Julia who convinces him to keep going with it. On the other hand, Borden's wife Sarah, who is only mentioned once or twice in the book, is a fascinating character in the movie. The idea of having to live with somebody with this dual personality is really analyzed through her character, and it strengthens the theme of Borden's sacrifice as we see just how far he's willing to go to maintain his illusion.
Do you love me?
Not today. No.
Cutter, Angier's engineer, is also a stronger presence in the movie. The movie seems to have taken all the various assistants and helpers from the book and combined them into one character. Also, in the movie, Cutter works for both Angier and Borden, and so he's kind of the voice of reason between this feud, a part that Michael Caine is easily able to play. Olive Wenscombe, the double-crossing assistant who starts out with Angier and then goes on to work for Borden, is also better in the movie. The book Olive is mostly just annoying, and her character isn't fleshed out very well at all. Whereas the movie really looks into the moral dilemma that Olive faces with both of these men. Also, Scarlett Johansson. Now, the book does have 2 lifetimes worth of people to look through, and because of the nature of the story, it makes sense that we wouldn't get to know all of them. Plus, the book introduces us to the descendants of both men, showing us how the rivalry has echoed through the generations. The novel actually begins with the meeting of the great-grandchildren of Borden and Angier, and Borden's and Angier's stories are told entirely through their journals. We hear of several failed attempts at reconciliation between the two families, of which this frame story is the most recent. For all that, though, the present-day characters just aren't very interesting. They're basically just vehicles for the stories of our 2 main characters, but they don't really have well-developed personalities of their own. In fact, the whole frame story just seems unnecessary, and it's that many more words to read, so it's probably just as well that it was eliminated from the movie. Overall, even though there aren't as many characters in the movie, they are far more interesting and much better developed. It's clear that the book wanted to focus strictly on these 2 main characters, but the movie's glimpse into the lives of these others really adds a lot to the enjoyability of the movie. But what about the complicated and admittedly rather confusing way that these stories are put together? Here's composition. While both stories structure their plots around the journals of the 2 men, they are certainly different. In the book, we get the stories of both men individually. We start with the frame story from the point of view of the Borden descendant, then Borden's journal, then the frame story from the point of view of the Angier descendant, then Angier's journal, and finally, the wrap-up chapter. This lends to the aura of secrecy and deception because we know Borden isn't telling us everything, and we know that Angier has destroyed the parts of the journal that reveal his secrets. It's also interesting to see the same story from 2 different points of view, and watching the missing puzzle pieces from Borden's journal be filled in as we read Angier's journal. The movie's composition accomplishes the same thing, but it's a little more confusing. We do hear the story through the journals, but the stories are kind of schmoozhed together, and so we're actually getting 3 portions of the timeline simultaneously. We have the present-day portion, where Angier has died and Borden has been accused of killing him and is reading Angier's journal while awaiting execution. We have the flashback through Angier's journal, where Angier is visiting Nikola Tesla to either learn the secret to Borden's trick or get a device that will be better than Borden's trick, while also reading and deciphering Borden's journal, and so we have a flashback within that flashback to the very beginning of their careers and showing the start and progression of the feud between them. This does make the story more compact and more objective, and it's actually not as confusing as you might think. The 3 timelines look different enough from each other that you can almost always tell where and when you are in the story, and to be honest, this story is supposed to be confusing. That is kind of the point. However, while it may not be as confusing as you might think, it's still confusing. You really have to pay attention to the movie. I mean, it is a Christopher Nolan film. And that's not to say that you don't have to pay attention to the book, and that's not to say that I don't like complicated composition, because as we already know, I do. I mean, okay, I'm not Matt, but I'm his clone, and I like the same things that he likes. But I also really like hearing a story from one person's perspective, hearing the same story from another person's perspective, and piecing everything together. And I love how much the style and composition of the journals really tells us about the personalities of these two characters. In the end, while I admire the way that Christopher Nolan put this story together, I really do like Christopher Priest's style and composition and how much it added to the story. But let's look at the way that science and magic are portrayed in imagery. Now, if you've seen a Christopher Nolan film, then you already know what a dark tone he sets, and also how incredibly innovative the imagery is. I love watching Nolan's special effects because they don't look like special effects. Despite the fact that we're dealing with magic and science and all sorts of weird supernatural things, the special effects are very simple and straightforward, very rarely resorting to CGI like a lot of films seem to do. The few scenes that are bright and flashy as far as special effects go mostly involve Augier using Nikola Tesla's machine, and really that's kind of the point of Augier. To show that the bright and flashy showman is ultimately inferior to the very simple trick of the better illusionist, Borden. But I think I still prefer the imagery from the book simply because of the way the two journals are written. The philosophies and personalities of these two men permeate this story because the story is told from their hands. And just like with the composition, the tone of secrecy and deception is in the very writing of these journals, whether it's Borden's admission to not telling us everything, or Augier's destroying the parts of the journal that he doesn't want people to see. Also, because we're getting first-hand descriptions of the wonders taking place, it seems a little more gritty and real. Both stories have brilliantly conceived imagery, but just like with composition, I like the way that Christopher Priest does it a little bit better. So now let's look at these very weird and complicated stories. Again, both versions are very different, and they both focus on different themes. One of the themes in both versions, though, is the lengths to which a stage illusionist will go in order to maintain the integrity of his illusion. The example used also in both versions is a magician whose claim to fame is making a large goldfish bowl, complete with water and goldfish, appear out of thin air. Without actually revealing the secret, suffice it to say that his life is altered irrevocably simply so he can continue performing this illusion without anybody realizing how he does it. The movie capitalizes on this theme with one of obsession. By the end of the movie, we see that both of these men have gone to great lengths and sacrificed much just to keep their reputations as flawless stage illusionists alive. This obsession also carries over into their desire to discover the secret of the other illusionist's trick. And we see in both stories that while this obsession brings both magicians to the height of their careers, they also pay dire consequences and make sacrifices for their actions. And while the book never really resolves, it does pose the question of whether or not the fame was worth the obsession. We also see in the book that the obsession and enmity carries through the generations and is still being damaging to both families. But again, the frame story was pretty unnecessary. The movie puts all the focus on the two magicians, which is really where it should be. And there are quite a few things that are introduced in the frame story that don't really go anywhere, like the very detailed explanation as to why Borden is visiting Augier in the first place, or the fact that he seems to be sexually attracted to her. I don't know. These are unnecessary plot elements that slow the story down before it even begins. And like number 3 said, the book doesn't really resolve, which normally I don't mind, but it just doesn't feel finished. It's like the author forgot to add the last few chapters. The movie has unresolved issues too, but at least it feels finished. But the focus of both stories is the relationship between the two men. In the book, the rivalry between the two men started early in their careers. Borden strongly objected to Augier's fake seances, so much so that he exposed his tricks in the middle of one of his performances. Though he later regretted his actions, from then on, they were enemies. At several points during the book, they both questioned the necessity of the feud, and Augier even makes the point at the end that they would have made better friends than enemies. What's most interesting about this feud is that while they both despise each other, there's still a kind of mutual respect for the other's abilities. And yet, they're still driven by their envy and their mutual dislike. But the feud is far more interesting in the book just because it's more personal. The book's feud is mostly just petty and envy-driven, with neither party really being sure why they're feuding. And while that's interesting in its own way, it does get old pretty fast. In the movie, they don't immediately start out as enemies. They actually start out as associates working for the same magician, and they remain friends as their careers get started. But then during a trick, Augier's wife drowns, and it seems to be due to a knot that Borden tied for the trick. Augier's retaliation then is driven by passion, not pettiness. And even as the feud escalates, Angier's actions are driven by the fact that he was denied the happy life that Borden took away. Angier from the book doesn't have this motivation. Yes, Borden might have been responsible for the death of his unborn child, but that's not quite as bad as losing your wife, and Angier and his wife still get a happy life in the end. So after a while, you just start to wonder why they're still bothering with the feud, and so much of it seems so childish. The feud in the movie is something that we can relate to much more easily, and because of that, I think it makes the better story.